today to share her message titled Justice, Equity, Reparations Require a Whole New World. And guess what? It is happening. So with that said, please welcome Ruth Miller.
All these little things we get to do to get started. My goodness. Yesterday was the Lunar New Year. 2 billion people celebrate the Lunar New Year. That's pretty impressive. It's not doing its thing. There we go. And in honor of that, I'm going to light this other candle. Some of you may recall that last year I kind of decorated the space. Yeah, this year I couldn't find them. So.
You gave them to us. You gave them away to us.
Yeah, there is that. I gave them all. So I hope you're lighting your red lamps. Red is good fortune in the Asian tradition. And having a red lantern is inviting all that goodness into our lives. And if you put little poems on red paper next to your door, you can invite even greater good fortune and hold away that which you no longer wish to experience. Yeah. So, isn't it interesting that most of us know nothing about something that over 25% of the world is celebrating?
Yeah. That's why you're here.
Well, that's why I kind of lumped it with this notion of reparation. Yeah? Because we have lived in a silo called white, European, Western industrial civilization. And that silo has kept us from knowing much about our brothers and sisters and nieces and nephews and grandchildren around the planet. And so it's always helpful to kind of carve a window in a silo. I don't know if any of you ever spent any time on a farm in the Midwest where they have silos, but my family had this one, a big round one that's big, not narrow, not tall and narrow, but flat and round. And it had little gaps, and I would crawl up in there and I'd hang out in the corn and the oats, which is a great sensation. And I'd look through the gaps at the world around. And it was marvelous, yes? This is a good thing to do. I encourage it. But it's very hard, if we're not aware of that world out there, to take it into consideration when we are thinking and doing and acting for ourselves. And so the fact that we have lived in this silo has meant that we have lived in a way that has not always been beneficial for people in other places and in other ways of living. And that's part of why people have this conversation going, and have for about 150 years, called reparation. After I chose the title, I found this marvelous book, Reconsidering Reparation, by Olufemi Taiwo, and he has lectures all over the internet, and I'm drawing a few slides from his lecture in what we're doing here, because he is going beyond the idea of reparation. He's pointing out that the whole planet's social structure began with this transatlantic slavery and colonialism that Western Europeans engaged in for a couple of hundred years. Now, it's only a couple of hundred years, and we're only a couple hundred years out of it, right? And it is true that those very same Western Europeans that started doing transatlantic shipping of slaves stopped doing that. So it's not like, someone else came in and made him do it, right? So the people that started it stopped it, but the impact is everywhere on the planet. And one of the things that has happened is this notion of other. Because we live in this silo, anyone outside my silo is an other.
Right.
And other is by definition something to be afraid of. I have a friend that says the immune system is all about me, not me. If it's not me, I don't want it, right? And our whole psyche tends to work in alignment with that, yeah? So we have declared that anyone that's not inside our notion of how life is, which was given to us, trained into our brain by the culture we were enculturated in, is going to be other. There are cultures where that's not the case. There's this marvelous, marvelous phrase in the people we call the Inuit, the people who live up in the Alaskan islands. And basically their greeting is, hello, my other self. Nice. Yeah. So to get beyond reparation, we need to get beyond the idea there is an other. We have to recognize that everyone out there is myself in another form. And that form is something I get to engage in curiosity to discover more about, just like Helen was sharing about her friend Dove. Yes? We get to know more about the people that we had made up our minds, pigeonholed, I believe you said, right? About because of the information we had before. Yeah, so that's the first step. If we're going to go beyond the notion of we got to fix things for those folks we did things to, we got to stop making those folks, right? So that's a big part of it. He goes on to suggest that most of the advantages of the current global system have been accumulating up here in the temperate climates of Northern European and North American cultures. And that is true, yeah. And most of our waste has gone back down to the other side of the planet. And we are dealing with that, having to deal with that every day. A huge part of what we're calling climate change is the result of that. So his point is if that transatlantic slavery made what is happening today our norm, then we need to rebuild the world. We did not have the world continue to be the way it is now. It has to happen in a whole new way. I loved it that this came to me after I decided I wrote the description for this talk. Because it says, oh good, I'm not the only one out there. And in fact, as I say, there's half a dozen YouTubes out there. Other people are listening to them, and I love it. It's very academic, so you kind of have to get into that mode. All right. He does suggest this other text, World Making After Empire, that says that anti-colonial nationalist movements have come out of that recognition that if we're going to find a way to establish justice and equity in the world, we have to create a different kind of structure. And a lot, those of you who have listened to me before are familiar with my idea that we live in what is an empire culture where the values are acquire, accumulate, and control. And so what we only have to do is restructure our system. We have to rethink our values. And I encourage people to look at indigenous values, and a lot of people who are in the anti-colonialist movement are realizing, oh yeah, there's some richness in the values that we have said, oh no, that's primitive. That's other, that's primitive. There is richness in that we can learn from and benefit from. This, I didn't expect you to read. It's okay. It's okay. But this is a commentary on the Emancipation Proclamation. Most of us were not given the whole story by any means. So you may be aware that prior to the actual proclamation, Lincoln did a preliminary proclamation back in September of 1862, in which he said, if you continue to rebel against us, we're going to free your slaves. Your slaves, only the slaves in the states that were rebelling. And guess what? They did, and so he did. So January 1st, 160 years ago last year, the Emancipation Proclamation came into full force. So then 100 days later, with the rebellion unabated, the president issued the Emancipation Proclamation. All persons held as slaves within the rebellious areas are, and henceforward are free, shall be remain free. Isn't that interesting?
Yes.
Okay. Now there's another piece to it. Most of us were told that we had an agreement with the folks who were freed about 40 acres and a mule. Remember that? Yeah. Okay, if we go down to the next paragraph, a few days after the Union's victory in the Battle of Antietam, with this proclamation, right, he had hoped to, I guess, separate the Confederacy from Europe, basically. But it was a military measure. And one of the things that happened is as the Union forces went into the rebellious states, all the slaves would be freed. Over 200,000 freed slaves fought for the Union Army. Wow. And you can get a sense of what that was about if you see Denzel Washington's movie Glory. 200,000. It really was a military measure, okay? Now, it altered the character of the war, right? And there were all these people. And then the next thing that happened is Sherman said, I got all these slaves and these soldiers, and now they're all refugees. If they're not soldiers, they're refugees, and we need to find something for them. And he declared that each household would get 40 acres and maybe something like a mule in his area, South Carolina and Georgia only.
Yeah.
Only the refugees in the refugee camps, and only in those areas. Well, apparently that 40 acres went from, 4 acres over here to 450 over there. And it was all over the map and never properly administered and never properly structured. And maybe there was a mule, or maybe there wasn't, or maybe there were half a dozen mules. We don't know. It was whatever. And there was one group that is still there on one of the islands off of South Carolina. They got 1,000 acres, and they're still there. And they have their own community. They almost have their own language. It's beautiful if you haven't followed up on that. But a lot of folks did not receive, and it certainly wasn't permanent, anything like what Sherman had proclaimed. So the Emancipation Proclamation and that whole thing was not nearly as cut and dry as most of us were taught in school. So the Brookings Institute is saying we need to have reparations. Now, I don't normally go to the Brookings Institution for things like this. They're a pretty, conservative is not the word. They're kind of off the right end of the spectrum. So I was really amazed to see this, and actually they do have a number of fascinating things around racism in this country. And they're saying, well, yeah, we need to have reparations. I just pulled 2 paragraphs. The average white family has roughly 10 times the amount of wealth of the average black family. And I'm going to say that's a function of real estate, because redlining prevented black families from acquiring appreciating real estate. And I was part of that 30 years ago, and we'll talk about that in a moment, helping turn that around. And a white college graduate has over 7 times more wealth than a black college graduate. Yeah, and that is as of 2020. That's not 1970s, okay? And then they point out that someone valued the bodies of the slaves in the US in 1860 at what would be $3 billion today. Wow. Just the bodies, the fact that they were working mechanisms. Yeah, and that was more than all of the industrial infrastructure put together throughout the rest of the country. So they're saying we need to do something here. We've created a system in which people cannot have the American dream, and that's their fundamental thing. They have not been able to have the American dream, and we need to make it possible for all human beings to have the American dream, at least on North America, right? So that's their point. Going back to Tomei's point, he's saying, wait a minute. If we keep looking backwards, we're going to have problems. We can't keep looking back to justify justice and equity and a world that works now. We have to start looking towards something that we can create. And so he's suggesting there's a constructive view of this. Rather than a repairing view, let's construct together. And I'm liking this is kind of like me, yeah, right? So he's suggesting, let's not go back and say we have to fix what happened then. Let's go now and see what we can do to facilitate people being able to have the American dream, right? Facilitate people being able to live the kind of life that they would ideally be able to live. And so then he suggests that we need to create a target state of affairs, and then if there are people being left out because the structure hasn't allowed it, then fix the structure so they're not left out in that target.
Yep. Right.
Very nice. Yeah, absolutely. And specifically, he's suggesting we need to make sure everyone has access to security, political power, resources, and money, which is a distribution issue. That's all it is. It's a distribution issue. Making sure that housing and energy and environmental things are happening in appropriate ways for everyone, and that everyone has access to political power, regardless, and that everyone has access to resources, regardless, right? So when 30 years ago, last week, I was ordained. Thank you, I appreciate it. In a house that had been granted to me because the nonprofit I was working for went bankrupt. And they owed me. So they owed me, and they gave me one of the houses we were working on. This little nonprofit spawned 5 other nonprofits, and between all of us, our little nonprofit did 13 houses, but the overall, we did 500 houses that had been abandoned and derelict because of policies in the inner city of Portland. Yeah, and those policies included redlining. The only place anyone of color could buy anything was in this neighborhood or said neighborhoods. And we were watching it happen while we were doing this work. Our designer was not allowed to look at any properties outside of our neighborhoods. Really? She happened to have very beautiful ebony skin, right? Yes. So what we did, besides started working on these houses, and the reason we went bankrupt, this particular nonprofit that I was helping, was because he was having to borrow money at 25% because of the neighborhood we were in, right? In order to fix these houses. And we would take an abandoned and derelict house. We would borrow on the order of $25,000, turn the house around, the whole house, turn something that was usually a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house into a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house for $25,000. This was 30 years ago. But still. And we would then make it available. We would teach people who had only been renters for generations what it meant to buy a house. How do you go about doing it? What are the hidden costs in buying that you haven't been paying except in your rent, right? And that sort of thing. So we created this housing center and classes, and I developed the class. And then we got the banks involved. They had something called Community Reinvestment Act funds that they were required by the federal government to put into neighborhoods they had redlined in the past. So we created a housing center using the banks, the mortgage lenders, and the real estate folks and nonprofit folks. And we got the whole district turned around. So it is now a very mixed race district. It's about 30% white, about 30% black, and about 30% everything else you can imagine. And if you've ever had a nice meal on Alberta Street, we did it, all right? So that was us, a group of us saying, let's do this, yeah? There was a company called Minority Business Enterprises, Sam Brooks, he worked with us, and he's part of what created Alberta Street. And now, interestingly, once a month, I'm back in that neighborhood. I'm speaking at church in that neighborhood again. It's fascinating. Yeah, fascinating. And so now we're teaching, giving people the inner resources to continue what we began with. Now, the house that I was in when I got ordained, and I was ordained in the living room that we were rehabbing in the moment, you know, and I brought in a bunch of the people I was working with, I was able to sell to a single mom who was working as a janitor in the high school where my daughter was attending. And I was able to sell it to her on contract, and then she was able to get a loan for the little bit that remained on her contract through one of her friends, a black mortgage lender, yes. But the value of that house on Zillow a year ago was $650,000. When she sold that house, she began to have wealth, yeah? And because I was able to get her into this house and work with her, she got into an electrician's apprentice program. Yeah. And so her daughter has graduated from college and is now a social worker, right? And one of my neighbors in that house was a Native American woman. She was 21 with 5 kids. I was at Trader Joe's in Northeast Portland, and I heard across the room, "Is that you, Ruth?" Yeah. She is working as a social worker, having gotten into the single parents program, and through the single parents program at the community college, gone into the 4-year college, gone into graduate school. She's an MSW, she's Native American, working with Native Americans in Portland, yeah? Yes. This is what we do when we have a target and a vision and an expectation, just living life. This was not my career to help these people, okay, at that time. I was supposed to be doing other things, but I happened to do a little bit of that along the edges, and that's what makes things happen in our world. So providing housing, providing resources, showing people the path, supporting them on that path is a huge part of it on a one-on-one basis, but it happens globally as well when we can see it and hold it. So among his ideas for ways to deal with some of the redistribution are canceling college debt for black students. Yeah, because it was harder for them to get there in the first place, right? I did attend an inner city school when I was growing up, and my mother pulled me out and put me in the university lab school after the science teacher had us leaning over a pot of boiling mercury. Oh. Yeah, he was a good guy, but really? All right, so that was a huge piece. How do we, get that overweening debt out of the inner city, basically, and try to redo it? The idea, one of the points that he makes early on is the allocation of, toxic dumps, right? It's far more often close to inner city or black neighborhoods than anywhere else, right? And barrios now. And so can we start redistributing things like that? So he's suggesting if we're looking at a world that works for everyone, let's start thinking in those terms. And he's ultimately saying the only way we're going to make this is for everyone to move in the direction of climate. I think it's interesting that he's kind of copying the Selma Bridge photo with that, but it isn't. This is a climate justice march. Okay, detoxification protects landfills, kill. Dump, so remaking the world from that perspective is as important as remaking it from a social perspective, right? They work together. So I was ordained 30 years ago, but at the time I was working as I ran a center where we taught sustainability consultants. And I put together a little handbook for my students, so in '93. And that little handbook provided some guidelines for how do you create structures that work. And why would you create structures like that? That handbook has evolved, and it is now the book Home. And this is the ebook version that's available on Amazon. And in that book, one of the things that I lay out is the myths, if you will, the misunderstandings actually that we hold about how economies work. And that set of values, acquire, accumulate, and control, has driven Western economic structures and theories for 400 years, basically since Adam Smith, right? If you want to know more about all that, read Robert Heilbroner's The Worldly Philosophers. Fascinating reading, excellent, good stuff, okay? Or you can read the economics chapter in my book. And what that idea that we have to acquire, that we have to accumulate, that we have to control has led us to do everything we have done on this planet. So I say if we continue as we have, then when all the trees have been harvested and all the seas have been harvested, the seas, the estuaries have been filled in for more suburban housing. Oh, and by the way, this guy says suburbs are a luxury.
Yep.
That's an interesting concept, yes, all right? When there are no more natural resources to use for materials, humanity will use our inventiveness to come up with other ways, right? As the oil reserves are depleted, we go to solar and wind. I wrote this 30 years ago, okay, right? And we'll figure out ways to reuse and recycle what we've got. We've been doing that, sort of. And we'll figure out, how to, use more, filter the water, and almost all of us are using water filters, even our church sanctuaries are in there, in order to deal with the fact that the water isn't clean anymore, right? Now, I will say it wasn't clean 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 300 years ago, even 50 years ago here in Oregon. I mean, this is part of being in civilization to not have clean water. Okay, now, as we do this, and as the world's scenarios unfold, and this is why I stopped being a futurist, by the way, I figured out there was somewhere on the planet where every single scenario we'd ever developed was happening now, right? So just go where you want to go, right? But sometimes in some places, that's gonna look like Mad Max. That's gonna look like this desert where we're just squeezing by, right? And groups of folks are marauding and at war or whatever, because they've hung on to the old values and the old way of doing things. And in other places, it's going to be, how can we live basically underwater? And there is a Filipino tribe that figured that out years ago, by the way. They basically live underwater. There isn't any land anywhere near them because of flooding. And so there are other islands figuring out how to live as water-based cultures rather than living as land-based cultures, right? In other places, people are going to be living like what we consider Australian Aborigines to live like, or Amazonian Aborigines. They're going to be living with almost nothing on their bodies and almost no physical material culture at all, because that's what's possible. But a lot of people are going to thrive in gardening villages, permaculture villages. And the reason I know this
is I can go back 10,000 years and find communities that are still thriving as gardening villages that were founded then. Isn't that amazing? Cities come and gone. Urban areas come and gone. Suburbans, we're a very new idea, suburb. And this town, by the way, is just one big suburb, the way that you laid it out, unfortunately. That all goes. It rises and it goes. But these little tiny communities that are basically self-sufficient, I found that they tend to be about 80% self-sufficient, sometimes 90, continue to thrive. The empire comes and goes. Doesn't matter if it's the Roman Empire, the German Empire, the Catholic Empire, the US Empire, they continue to thrive. So my little book, Home, is how do we allow ourselves to live in an environmentally friendly way, a socially accepting way, a spiritually fulfilling way. Yes? This is my target for how we can be creating a new world. Now, I've shared some of my own experiences and some of the few things that I've done, and I happen to know about half of the people in this room right now, and so I know that that half has been doing some of this all along. And I'm sure that the ones of you I don't know have been doing something like this as well. You've been contributing in some way to facilitating a world in which the people around you and the people you may not ever have met have been able to experience a fuller life and have access to the resources and the security they need to be able to use Maslow's hierarchy to be able to move up to self-actualization, right? Because all those lower needs are met. Yes, I know you're doing that. But more importantly, I know that you come together into a group like this and hold the possibility of our 7 principles being implemented in the world. And that will do more than almost anything any one of us can do, because we have this thing called morphic resonance. Right. That which we know and are and be and say resonates across the planet. So I wrote this little book 30 years ago, and it's evolved. It's evolved. And here's someone else coming along from another angle, saying pretty much the same thing. We need to do what's in this book. And I never heard of him. I never saw his work. He never saw my work. This is morphic resonance. This is what happens as the world begins to align on the values that the Unitarian Universalist Association has delineated and that we have adopted by being here at Truth. Thank you all. All right, I'm supposed to do meditation. I remember. So someone could turn off the lights. So I invite you to relax in this chair, in this time, in this room. And be aware that none of us is isolated, that all of us are connected with people across time, across the planet. You can feel the threads of connection reaching back into history, reaching forward into the future that is emerging around us, reaching around to all the people that are resonating with who each of us is now. Just breathe and feel those connections. Feel the information and the energy flowing to and from. Feel the power of the connections flowing into and through your body and into the mind. And feel that power and that strength and that wisdom and understanding as it moves out into the world. The world that we, each of us and all of us live in. And feel how the values that have been structuring this world are shifting and changing. It's almost as if there is this gunk that is being dissolved and flowing out of the world. And the world is becoming lighter and brighter. Simply in our awareness as we breathe. That power, that strength, that wisdom, that understanding that we all share as humanity. Flowing in us, through us, and around us. Just absorb it for a little while. Bathe in the beauty of it. And feel the potential unfolding. And now allow that light, that love that is who each of us is at the core of our being and who all of us really are. Feel that light and that love wash through the body and the mind and the world around it. Yes. That is who and what we are. And that is who and what we are creating. Now take a cleansing breath and bring yourself back into this room with this amazing community. And know this world is our birthright and is